Good afternoon, it's Gary Sly and the Legacy of Handmade Objects. It's Monday afternoon, March the 3rd, so we're heading into a new month. This is where I grew up in Virginia, the time when the buds began to peek up through the ground a little bit, but there's still a good bit of cold weather around. Here in Florida, we've got still a few cool nights down in maybe the 50s, perhaps 40s. But you can tell that spring is not too far away. The way the season works here, at least in this part of Florida, is that from May the 1st to October the 1st, it's very hot and very humid. The rest of the time, the other 7 months, I like to call paradise because it's just so wonderful here. You can go out and move around. Sometimes you need a little sweater in the mornings, but not too much else. I am heading off on a trip, so next Monday I will post something, I assume, but I'll be out traveling. First few days I'm going to be in Nashville, Tennessee for the big Needlework Expo. Many of you, if you inhabit local shops or talk to people who are stitchers or designers, will have heard of the Nashville market before. If you look back at some of my videos from this time last year, you'll see I did a few interviews with designers, and I also did a little tour of the marketplace. So I'll do some similar things this year. Hopefully sit down with some of the folks that are creating some of the beautiful patterns that we love, but also I'll walk around some and just give you a feel for what marketplace is like. As a shop owner, it's a pretty exhausting few days. We're told that there's about 150 designers and shops who are going to be selling products this year. Many of us are taking pre-orders or at least making lists of things that we want to get when we go to market. But somehow or another, over the course of roughly 2 days, Friday afternoon, all day Saturday, and most of the day Sunday, we have to visit all those 150 shops and do the purchases that we need to bring back. Of course, it's an exciting time when we get back to the shops. Give your local shop a few days to get everything unpacked and priced. But very soon we'll have all kinds of new designs back in our shops. If I recall correctly, there's something like 300 different shops who come and purchase things during Marketplace. Probably your local needlework shop, if it's cross-stitch related, will be there. There's a similar marketplace for needle pointers, and of course all the other crafts have their conventions and marketplaces as well. So I'm getting things ready and getting prepared to do that, and then I'm going to head out a little farther west into Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, and do some traveling around, visiting some sites that are important to me, and I'll let you know a little more about that when I get back. I think I'll leave that till later. I always ask at Christmas time for folks who are going to be buying me Christmas presents to consider buying me some of the books that I've been eyeing over the past year and that I want to read. And so I thought today might be a good time to do a little bit of a book review, because I have been working my way through some of the texts that I received at Christmas time. A couple of these I've mentioned in the past, but I'm going to talk a little more in depth about each of them here today, and then I'll give you a list of these books in case they're things that you want to try to find a little bit later. The first is a book that I've mentioned before because the ladies in my stitching group on Thursdays bought this for me for Christmas, and I know it was rather expensive because it's a wonderful out-of-print book. It's called Rosie Grier's Needlepoint for Men. And I have to say, I've been hearing about this book since I was a young man. It was published in 1973 at a time when it was pretty unusual for men to be doing any stitching, and if they did, they probably didn't tell anybody about it. But Rosie Grier was a great big burly football player, and that's what made it even more remarkable that he became known as a needlepointer. I haven't started reading this one yet, so I'm going to, but it's a substantive book. He's got a lot of good information here, and it really is something that would especially lend itself to male stitchers. But I did find this wonderful picture of Rosie with a needlepoint design that he created himself, with him there smiling out and looking wonderful in that needlepoint. And this is needlepoint as opposed to cross stitch. But of course, as you know, the patterns and designs for needlepoint and cross stitch can really translate back and forth. With needlepoint, you're just doing a tent stitch for the most part, unless you do a lot of fancy stitches. But you can use those same patterns in cross stitch, and you can also use cross stitch patterns in needlepoint. But as I say, it's a substantive book. He gives you a bit of a history of needlepoint. He talks about materials. He looks specifically for designs that men might be interested in doing. So designs for sportsmen, designs for the ladies or special people in your life, designs that might work in your home or your office. And he really does give some very practical ideas about how you can create designs that are meaningful to you. And of course, you know, that's a theme that I've driven home so many times. When we put the hours and the attention that we do to stitching, it certainly matters, at least it does to me, what I stitch. And I like to be sure that I'm creating things that are meaningful to me or that are significant gifts that I could give to others. So this book is out of print. It was $10 when it was originally published, and I suspect there may still be some out there. If you happen to see one, it's a pretty rare find, and it might be something you would enjoy having. Another older book that I got, and I have people who love me so much that they'll look these up and try to find them on Amazon or wherever they found them, is a book called The Needlework of Mary Queen of Scots. And this is by a very renowned needlework scholar named Margaret Swain, S-W-A-I-N. Surprisingly enough, this book was also published in 1973. At that time, it cost $9.95, so around $10. But the person that bought this for me, I think, had to go a little further afield and work a little harder to find this. Margaret Swain has written a number of books, all out of print, all from the period of the 70s and the 80s. And if you go back, you can see that I did some discussion of Mary Queen of Scots earlier in the series because Claire Hunter, one of my favorite modern writers, did a whole book on Mary Queen of Scots. So if you're interested in her legacy and what we know about her stitching, this is a great resource. Not only does it give you a pretty decent history of Mary Queen of Scots, which is something you can find in quite a few books, but she's done a pretty good job of taking pictures or gathering pictures from places like the Victoria and Albert Museum in London of stitching that Mary Queen of Scots actually created. You may remember the history of Mary Queen of Scots is that she was imprisoned in England by Queen Elizabeth I because she was kind of a threat to the empire. So she had a remarkable amount of time to work on stitching. And her stitching did have quite powerful meaning to it. It had messages to it, which is something I'm going to talk about in a minute with a couple of modern books that I have. But I guess if we have a theme for today, it is that stitching can be a powerful tool. It can create a powerful voice for us. And what we choose to stitch and how we choose to stitch it can also express pretty strong opinions. So those of us who do it, I'm sure, make choices about what we stitch based on the things that are important to us. I have a PhD in literature, and of course I love fine literature and fine writing. But I find at this stage in my life, I'm much more interested in reading nonfiction. I guess maybe I want to know as much as I can about how to do things in the time that I have left in this world. And so some of the books that draw me in and that I'm most interested in reading these days have to do with nonfiction, but related to the whole idea of the legacy of handmade objects, particularly as it is expressed through fiber arts. So I did a whole session on the sacred textile art of Tibet and Buddhism from the book called Threads of Awakening. And I won't spend too much time on this right now because I did do a whole episode on it, but I do recommend this book. It's not just about the stitching of Tonka, but it really does give you an idea of this woman's journey as a Westerner, as an American, going to India, living near the compound where the Dalai Lama lived, learning a lot about Tibetan culture and influence, and bringing that and the skill of Tonka back to the United States. You know, she's known all over the world for her beautiful work, and this book is a very readable text that gives you a chance to learn something about her exploration. Now, the last two books I'm going to talk about today are pretty explicitly political or activist. There's a term that was created back in the early 2000s to express activism as we see it in fiber arts or in other craft areas, and that's called craftivism. So it really goes back to what I was saying just a minute ago about Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, in her captivity, stitched certain things that she knew were going to be controversial. She claimed, for instance, in kind of an offhanded way, that she was heir to the British throne. And she was the reigning Queen of Scotland during the time that she was imprisoned, at least depending on who you talk to about it. So creating emblems and using symbols that expressed her idea of her own self as a queen were controversial at the time and very politically charged. And that's some of the reason why she was in prison. So in our divisive political environment today, you'll also see that craft or craftivism, as we talk about, as that term is used today, is quite important. I hesitate to express my own political, religious opinions on here. I certainly have them. You know that I'm a retired Methodist minister, but I have this great love for world religions. You can probably guess that I have pretty strong opinions about social issues and politics and all those sorts of things. But it's not my role to convince you of anything. But I did come across a couple books that I thought were quite interesting, that it gave me some insight into this whole idea of craftivism. So Crafting Democracy is a book subtitled Fiber Arts and Activism. It was edited by Juilee and Hinda Mandell. And basically this, it gives you a little overview of that whole idea of craftivism that I was talking about. But then it highlights an exhibit that was done. Let me look just very quickly here. It was an actual art exhibit that was done in a major museum where various people created works to express their opinion on the political environment in the U.S. I'll just kind of leave it at that. If you want to explore it, it's fascinating, and it's got some really good, everything is well illustrated because it's about an art exhibit that took place. Just to give you a little bit of insight, it took place right after the election of Donald Trump as president in 2016. So you might guess there's some pretty strong feelings expressed there. Crafting Democracy, Fiber Arts and Activism. It may not be something that you're interested in, but if you're looking for ways to express yourself and you love to do fiber art, this might give you some interesting ideas. A broader book called Crafting Dissent, D-I-S-S-E-N-T, Dissent, really looks at handicraft as protest or craftivism, beginning with the American Revolution and going all the way up into the modern day. one of the illustrations and one of the things you see on the cover is from the American Revolution, where at that point people didn't have photographs taken, they had portraits painted of themselves and their families. And in the cover story, one of the major figures in the colonies before we became a country had themselves painted with the woman actually weaving or making cloth. And while that may sound kind of simple and innocuous, it was a very strong political statement at that time, because the colonies were trying to decide whether they were going to break away from England. And one of the ways they argued that they would need to accomplish that is that they would have to become independent of British goods. So they wouldn't be able to use linens and fabrics that were made in England. They would have to make them here in the United States. So it was a pretty strong political statement for someone to have their portrait painted making their own fabric, or doing their own handwork, or creating things that normally, if you were upper class, you would buy from England. So that's just an example, but this really is a quite in-depth look at everything from protests against Donald Trump to earlier discussions of abolitionism and the KKK and various ways that people dealt with that. Activism as women were looking for the right to vote during the suffragette movement. It really is a pretty good overview of how important fiber art in particular, in this case, can be in terms of expressing our opinions and even making changes in the world. There's a story in here about a major company in England who actually began to pay their workers more because of a protest that took place using crafts. So, you know, those are out there. I'll list them and tell you the authors and give you a little information in the description of today's episode. But maybe it'll get you thinking a little bit. If you have ever crafted something because you wanted to express a particular message, or if you have messages you'd like to express but you don't feel like you're the type to go out and say them out loud or to argue with people, perhaps craftivism is an expression of your own opinions that you might be interested in. I don't tell you what to do. I'm not your papa. My goal is just to try to expose some of these ideas and talk about ways that the legacy of handmade objects has impacted our world. And I just think it's a good time as we think about the environment around us today, socially and politically, to ponder those ideas. So that's it. I'm going to be heading off for Nashville Thursday morning. Hopefully I'll have a couple remote episodes as I'm traveling. But anyway, have a great March. March on through and start thinking about warmer weather. This is Gary Sly, and it's the legacy of handmade objects.